Hello, I'm Andy Birtwistle, and I'm delighted to introduce my new book, Film Sound Modernism, published by the British Film Institute. In this video, I'd like to offer a taster of the book, which explores how sound has shaped cinema as a modern and a modernist art form, a topic that's often overlooked in discussions of film and modernism. My aim is to show how filmmakers around the world, working at different times, have used speech, music, and sound effects to respond to the experiences of modernity. Before getting into one of the case studies from the book, here's a quick overview of what you can expect. The book opens with what I call a sound walk through modernism, in which I discuss how the defining features of modernist aesthetics relate to film sound. Things like abstraction, fragmentation, and the foregrounding of form. I then explore the ways in which a range of filmmakers, working in different geographical contexts and at different times, have articulated a concern with the conditions and experiences of modernity through distinct poetics of sound. Firstly, I listen to the use of environmental sound in the films of Michelangelo Antonioni and Tsai-Ming Liang, and think about how the way they use the sounds of wind and rain articulate something of their own attitudes towards modernity, that is, the conditions and experiences of living in the modern world. In the following chapter, my focus is on the work of two of the key directors of the Taiwan New Cinema movement of the 1980s, Ho Xiaoxian and Edward Yang, and how their approaches to environmental sound, including the sounds of traffic, insects and water, relate to the dramatic political, social and economic changes that were taking place in Taiwan during this period. In Chapter 4, I discuss two films that feature the disruptive speech of non-actors. In the first, Herbert Klein and Alexander Hackenschmidt's The Forgotten Village, made in 1941, we witness the repression of what we might term the voice of the people. The second film I discuss in this chapter is Jean-Luc Godard's Un film comme les autres from 1968, in which the voice of the people is made disruptively audible. My final group of case studies explores artists' films in which we hear the voices of the filmmakers themselves, in work by Wojciech Bruszewski, Laura Mulvey, Sarah Turner and Wang Shui. Here I examine how the voice of the artist might challenge traditional ideas of authorship and self-expression in art, and also engage with questions of identity. The book then concludes with an afterword that reflects on its central findings and questions whether the idea of modernism can still provide a useful framework for thinking about film sound practices in the 21st century. With this context in mind, let's explore one of the book's case studies in more detail. Herbert Klein and Alexander Hackenschmidt's The Forgotten Village from 1941. Susan Stanford Friedman has argued that within the arts, modernism has been understood as a willed forgetting of tradition, continuity, order. It is the embrace of chaos. It is the crisis of representation, fragmentation, alienation. It is indeterminacy, the rupture of certainty. However, Friedman also proposes that there is another form of modernism, perhaps more familiar to the social sciences. She writes, "Modernism is state planning. Modernism is totalization, centralized system. Modernism is the Enlightenment's rational schema, progress, science, reason, truth." And it is this second form of modernism that I would like to think about in relation to the soundtrack of The Forgotten Village, a so-called ethno-fiction film made in 1941 by Herbert Klein and Alexander Hackenschmidt and written by John Steinbeck. What I'd like to focus on in my discussion is the disruptive power of what might be termed the voice of the people, in this case indigenous Mexican voices, and how these voices are contained by the film's makers to promote a particular vision of modernism. The film blends documentary and drama and was shot on location in Mexico. The narrative of the film centres around the conflict between tradition and modernity, and takes as its subject rural health. The film was made at a time when, according to its makers, 50% of children born in Mexican villages died from colitis or typhoid. The film's protagonist is Juan Diego, whose younger brother Paco becomes ill with typhoid and subsequently dies. Juan Diego then comes into conflict with both his family and his community when he proposes that the source of the illness that killed his brother and other children in the village may have been contaminated water from the village well. Encouraged by his school teacher, he embarks on a journey to the city to seek help from doctors working in a modern hospital. His claim that the illness may have been caused by the contaminated village well runs counter to the advice of Trini, the village's curandera, a wise woman or folk healer, whose brand of shamanic medicine identifies the source of the illness as bitter airs and evil spirits. The film is prefaced by a title declaring, "None of the people in this film are actors. They are peasants, doctors, teachers, etc. in real life. Most of the peasants have never seen a movie, but they understood our story well. It was part of their lives." The film's documentary qualities also derive from its narrative, which according to Steinbeck emerged from the lives of the villagers themselves. The crew moved into the village, made friends, talked, and listened. The story was simple. Too many children die. Why is that? And what is done about it, both by the villagers and by the government? The story actually was a question. What we found was dramatic. The clash of a medicine and magic that was old when the Aztecs invaded the plateau, with a modern medicine that is as young as a living man. However, despite the apparent participation of the villagers in both the development and realisation of the project, what strikes the listener on viewing the film is the complete absence of their voices from the soundtrack. The only speaking voice we hear is that of the American actor Burgess Meredith, whose beautiful voiceover narration, alongside Hans Eisler's modernist score, structures the soundtrack.
Trini the wise woman welcomed them to her little stone house where she merchandised in herbs and amulets and magic. "Come seat yourself," said Trini. "I'll give you the future, black or white. I'll cast it in the black and white corn. Pick out the corn, black for your boy children, white for the girl."
Steinbeck justifies this silencing of the film's participants in technical terms, offering the explanation, sound recorded on the scene was impracticable. The village was inaccessible to sound equipment. Dialogue was out of the question, even in Spanish, since many of the older people spoke little Spanish. They used the Indian language of their ancestors. Steinbeck offers no explanation as to why Spanish dialogue might somehow have been more acceptable than speech in the village's indigenous language, Nahuatl. But in any case, as Steinbeck makes clear, while taking the Mexican people as its subjects, the film was aimed squarely at filmgoers in the US. The solution adopted to these various problems is explained by Steinbeck in the following terms. The usual narrative method did not seem quite adequate. It was decided finally to use the method of the old storyteller, a voice which interpolated dialogue without trying to imitate it. This decision to model the film's voice-over narration on the oral storytelling tradition might be interpreted as a respectful attempt to capture or reflect something of the cultural traditions of the film's subjects, in much the same way that Hans Eisler's score for the film attempts to incorporate elements of Mexican folk music. And indeed, the technique of interpolating a character's speech into the film's voiceover narration does, to a limited degree, give voice to the film's performers. In his article Films Without Make-Believe, published in 1942, Klein recalls how Trini, immersed in performing her real-life role of the village curandera, began speaking during the dramatic scene that reconstructs the traditional childbirth practices of rural Mexico. The curandera got so wrapped up in the reality of the birth practice that she completely forgot the camera and the lights. Of her own accord, she began the ancient Aztec birth chant. The faces of all the women reflected Trini's belief, and we got the most gripping and effective scene of our film.
Between his knees he held her and braced against her pain. Now he is formed, now he is ready. Be of good courage, I am with you. Be of good courage, I am with you. He is born. He is here.
Yet even when striving to represent the authentic voice of the film's subjects, the voiceover, perhaps inevitably, creates a sense of distance from them, muting their voices. This sense of distance constructs the Mexican villagers as other. In part, this is due to a dislocation of sound and image. Burgess's narration rarely synchronizes the interpolated dialogue with the action on screen. And this sense of dislocation is further amplified by differences in language and gender. But in any case, a voiceover is always unlike other voices heard in the film, and has a particular status and power. In part, this is due to its non-diegetic character, removed as it is from the world represented on screen. At the same time, the combination of production techniques and performance style associated with voiceover create a close-mic'd, intimate quality that differs radically from the ways in which dialogue is rendered in location or ADR recordings. Burgess's voice is here, while the Mexican villagers portrayed on screen are there, and thus other. In this way, it is the voiceover, just as much as the exotic imagery of the film, that constructs the Mexican villagers as other. If the voices of the film's on-screen performers are absent in the film itself, they do, however, become audible in the filmmaker's accounts of the project. Both Klein's Film Without Make-Believe and Hackenschmidt's A Report on the Filming in Mexico, published in 1942 and 1947, detail some of the difficulties faced in making the project. Klein recalls that the villagers had never seen a film camera before and were suspicious of the crew's real intentions. The rumour spread that it was a surveyor's device, and that we were not people who made photographs, but were out to survey the land and take it away from its rightful owners. Klein continues to recount the various challenges faced when casting the film. The man they originally wanted for the role of Juan Diego's father backed out of the film when he found out he would be required to embrace the woman playing Juan Diego's mother, Esperanza. He said the woman's husband would get drunk at the pulqueria one night and kill him for touching his wife. Regarding the film's female lead, Klein explains, when the woman who agreed to play Esperanza heard how neighbour women were gossiping about her even before the filming started, she backed out too. Klein also states that the mother of the little boy they wanted to play the role of Juan Diego's younger brother, who dies of typhoid, was frightened when she heard her boy was to be shown as sickening and dying, for she feared, as many primitive people do, that the impersonation of sickness and death might lead to the real death of the child. Similarly, Hackenschmidt describes how one local landowner led a campaign against the project, saying we were hostile foreigners seeking to buy up the souls of peasants for a few pesos apiece. He told fantastic tales about how we intended to film naked women in the church. The voice of the people that emerges from these accounts is one of rumour, gossip, and superstition. And it is disruptive, making it difficult for Klein and Hackenschmidt to realise their project. Thus, the use of voiceover might be recast not simply as a technical matter devised to solve the problem of recording sound in remote locations, but rather as a strategy to contain the unruly voice of the people, adopted by the film's makers to mitigate what might be thought of as the problem of authenticity. It is employed precisely to ensure that the film's makers were able to represent their subjects according to Steinbeck's image of them, rather than the noisy, disruptive, uncompliant image that emerges in the filmmakers' accounts of the production. In this sense, then, it might be argued that the villagers are silenced in order that Steinbeck, Klein, and Hackenschmidt can speak for them. There is, of course, a paradox here. What the filmmakers found disruptive was the villagers' ignorance of the film production process. Yet at the same time, it is precisely ignorance that the villagers are required to perform in the film. That is, the film's drama centres on the conflict between tradition and modernity, with tradition formulated in terms of superstition and ignorance, and modernity in terms of the Enlightenment values of progress, science, reason, and truth. That the people Klein and Hackenschmidt were working with were to be portrayed in this way must have been difficult for the filmmakers to admit, since all the key creatives involved in the project considered themselves to be social progressives, and both Klein and Eisler were committed socialists. Hackenschmidt was certainly keen to stress the sense of friendship and collaboration from which the film emerged. Thus he reports that at a screening of a rough cut of the film, organised in Mexico City for the doctors and nurses of the Servicio Medical Rural, he was asked how it was possible for foreigners to be able to represent indigenous people with such accuracy. He then concludes his article with the following comment: "We were proud of our answer, that we did not try to press our interpretations, but rather were guided by villagers who became our friends." But this statement of respect is somewhat problematised by a comment made by Klein on the involvement of the curandera Trini in the film, which tries to navigate the line between respect for tradition and a modernist vision of scientific progress. Even Trini, the village curandera, consented to enact her real-life role in a film that was aimed at convincing the peasants that they should put their trust in modern medicine instead of witch doctors. The old lady put her greed for pesos in the hand ahead of her fears for competition in the bush. However, the lose-lose situation in which Trini is positioned by Klein, condemned both for being a witch doctor and for her paid participation in a project that criticises her profession, simply illustrates the broader problem of the film. That is, indigenous people are in a no-win scenario. If they are true to themselves and their own value systems, noisily resisting participation in the project, then they are constructed as superstitious and primitive. Yet if they accede to the filmmaker's demands, they are also represented as superstitious and primitive. Similar tensions and contradictions can be observed in relation to Hans Eisler's score for the film. To infuse the film with a sense of musical authenticity, after arriving in Mexico City, Eisler enlisted a group of local indigenous musicians to perform for him. The encounter was described by the New York Times journalist Theodore Strauss in a contemporary interview with Eisler. From villages as far as 80 miles distant, he began to bundle into the Klein living room a motley procession of native musicians, barefoot, impoverished, and full of grace. Out of what he heard, he later quoted literally perhaps no more than 15 minutes. In Eisler's quotation of indigenous Mexican folk music, again we witness some attempt to give voice to the people who the film aims to represent. However, in a pattern that repeats throughout the film's production, the apparently progressive attempt to lend an ear to its subjects appears to be in conflict with the values underpinning the modernist mindset of the film's makers. Thus, Eisler commented on two indigenous fiesta musicians who had helped him work on the film. They embraced me as their colleague when they left. They with their age-old Indian music, I with my background of modern European, and there was 2,000 years between us. Although ostensibly a statement of collegiality, suggesting the universality of music, nevertheless, Eisler's modernist perspective is located within the European Enlightenment tradition, which set people on a ladder of progress and which placed people like Eisler at the top. Strauss's article on Eisler reveals other ways in which the composer constructs the music of the indigenous musicians, and indeed the musicians themselves, as other. He writes, "The Indian themes were more pronounced in the noisy demonstration of a pair of fiesta musicians from some distant forgotten village who beat a drum and played a piccolo so loudly that Mr. Eisler was nearly deaf for days. They get damn serious when they play," said Mr. Eisler, "and sometimes you can't stop them. It is a little frightening." While here Eisler constructs the folk music of Mexico as frightening noise, elsewhere in the same interview he also figures it as corrupted and inauthentic. Describing a performance by street musicians in Mexico City witnessed by Eisler, Strauss writes, "Here he found the garbled influences of Spanish, French, Cuban, Hollywood, Indian and Tin Pan Alley music, but all set against a native rhythmical bass. Thus, if we understand Mexican folk music as one of the voices of its people, we see it constructed in fundamentally negative terms. It is, according to Eisler's comment, a primitive, corrupted form of noise." In conclusion, the sonic strategies employed in The Forgotten Village expose fundamental contradictions within certain forms of modernist thought, particularly in their approach to indigenous knowledge and expression. The film's treatment of voice and Eisler's attitude towards Mexican music emerge as key sites where modernist aesthetics intersect with colonial perspectives, revealing tensions between the film's democratic impulses and its silencing of indigenous voices. The film's sound design thus exposes how even well-intentioned documentary projects can reproduce colonial hierarchies, and reminds us of the centrality of sound to ethical documentary practice. Thanks for listening.